Oh man, good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, whoever's, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for attending. Super excited to be here with we're the band is back together, everyone. We're here to talk about the upcoming immediate state privacy laws, and we're so excited for everyone that's joining us this morning. I'm alongside Dave Barmore and Ron De Jesus. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining again with me.
Happy to be here.
The
It's
band is back
exciting.
together after so much demand, overwhelming demand.
All the ats on social media are just piling up over here. But why don't we get things kicked off here? Let me pull up my screen and we can jump in. Everyone that's joined, thank you so much for being here. If you have questions, feel free to shoot them through. And we'll try to answer them the best that we can. Let me know if you guys can see that.
I can. It's a beautiful slide
Amazing.
deck, if I do say so myself.
Yeah, it looks good. I wonder who put that together. That thing looks fantastic. Those colors are great. So, mastering immediate and upcoming state privacy laws. Let's go ahead and I've already introduced everybody. That's great. We're going to talk about APRA real quick as the first update. We're going to go into the U.S. laws that are going into effect here on July 1st. And then we're going to also talk about the newly passed laws that we've already come across and then open it up for Q&A. Let's go ahead and jump into the APRA update. Dave, if you want to kind of take us and hit on that first.
Cool. Thanks, Cameron. Again, great to be back with everyone, whether it's breakfast on the West Coast, lunch on the East Coast, or nighttime if you're anywhere else across the Atlantic. But just quick background on myself. So my name's Dave Barmore. I run my own boutique consultancy that's focused on public affairs. My background is more at the state level. However, I am based in Washington, D.C., but a lot of how I help my clients is overseeing all the state level developments across policy and regulatory issues. So data privacy obviously is one that is no stranger to state level updates, as we now, I think we're up to the total number of states that have passed their own comprehensive laws to be 20, I believe. So that number continues to tick up with every legislative calendar year. But I do think it'd be helpful to touch on, before we dive into the states, which I want to spend the majority of our time talking about, I do want to highlight just a couple updates that we've seen at the federal level. APRA, APRA, I know there's been much debate on how to pronounce it. I think we've all settled on APRA. This is the American Privacy Rights Act. For those of you that have been following, it was announced back in April, which is hard to believe. What, our first webinar was that long ago in April. We're already well into the summer here. But this was historic in that two of the committee leaders on both the House and the Senate side here on Capitol Hill announced an agreement for a federal framework that, if passed, would be the law of the land governing all data privacy issues across all 50 states. So again, up until this morning at I think 6 o'clock in the morning East Coast time, up until this morning, it was just a discussion draft. So there was no formal introduction of a bill. These were just broad contours of again, what the components of this kind of federal framework would be. I think what's interesting is, as of this morning, we finally, Cameron, if you want to actually advance to the next slide here.
Happy to.
Thank you, sir. As of this morning, we actually have a formal introduction and a bill number. So APRA can now be known as House Resolution 8818. And this is after there have been, now this is the third iteration or version of what we've seen. So there have been some interesting changes that have been made to the draft bill. And I think what will be really interesting to watch is tomorrow, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction on the House side, that is chaired by a woman named Kathy McMorris Rogers. She has announced she's retiring at the end of this year. So she is really pushing this as she wants this to be her legacy issue. So I think what you will see tomorrow is they've announced a full committee markup. So what a markup means is basically they're going to be, I think the number is 11 bills total for tomorrow. It's a long list of bills in addition to APRA that they're going to be debating and considering amendments, and then potentially even voting on and advancing out of committee. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the debate is tomorrow. I think there have been some recent changes to the bill that have riled some privacy advocates. They've removed some provisions to the latest draft where they have taken out the civil rights section, and have also removed a section that includes allowing consumers to opt out of consequential decisions made by algorithms. So I think those were two, pretty significant sections that have since been scrapped. And I think you've seen some privacy groups decry that those revisions. So I think it'll be interesting to see the debate around that. There's also been a lot of debate around the private right of action, which is the teeth of how this could be enforced. So you'll see some debate around the private right of action. You'll see debate around the preemption. I think since our last chat, you've seen the tech industry come out and say that the preemption language as it's currently drafted is not strong enough, and that we need to strengthen that preemption language so that it would fully preempt all the existing state laws in effect. So anyway, all this to say, there's a lot of ground that needs to be covered before this becomes law. And I think the last bullet here, and then I'll shut up and turn it over to Ron for his thoughts. There's already some intra-party fighting. So there's already drama that's brewing around this on the House side. We love some drama.
Yeah.
So there was a Politico article that came out last week stating that there is a reluctance to potentially bring this to the full House floor for a vote, even if it is passed out of committee. So I do think it'll be interesting to see, if this is passed out of committee tomorrow, one, will this advance to the full House floor for a vote, or will this suffer the fate of what previous privacy bills have been dealt with? If you can think back 2 years ago, ADPA made it out of committee. Then Speaker Pelosi never brought it to the floor. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether it gets brought to the House floor. And then it also has to go through the Senate, right? So we've got Senator Maria Cantwell and, all the changes that are being made by Republicans on the House side. Will she endorse that when it comes over to the Senate side? Big TBD there. So, and we're in an election year. We've got the presidential debate tomorrow. Things are really going to be heating up. So what that means, unfortunately, is that productivity here in DC will continue to decline. So we'll see. But I'm going to pause there. I know that was a whole lot. But Ron, anything that sticks out to you, anything that you're particularly looking out for with tomorrow's markup?
Yeah, first of all, I'd say, Dave, like the play-by-play from you is just super educational for folks like us who don't have that kind of on-the-ground insight. So thanks for that. I will say, as an outsider looking in, it's definitely interesting to see the amount of opposition from those groups that you mentioned. A couple of ones that I think are kind of notable are from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. They were super against the fact that there was a removal of language around data-driven discrimination and the requirement for AI impact assessments. So again, taking out the civil rights piece, but then also taking out the language around AI, governance and controls is telling, because there's been also some discussion around the fact that maybe this is not the right bill to have, AI kind of thrown in there and intertwined into a more kind of traditional privacy bill. So that was interesting. And then the Center for Democracy and Technology, the CDT, came out and said in their position paper that privacy legislation should clearly prevent discriminatory data practices. Agree to some extent. But again, it's the perspective of whether or not I think you used this yesterday, Dave, like kind of hanging things on a Christmas tree, how many things that you want to be kind of put into a bill, we kind of have to consider. So just interesting to see that this version of the bill is actually being thought of as the official draft, given the amount of opposition that you're seeing from advocacy groups, from folks from all over the sphere, is really interesting to see. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing the progression of this bill and seeing what comes out of tomorrow's hearing. So, but yeah, I mean, insofar as from a privacy operational perspective, we're really kind of excited to just follow the progression of this, because we're obviously still waiting for a federal bill. So
get your popcorn ready. Like I said, I think there's going to be some lively debate tomorrow. I do want to point out just one thing, Ron, so it's clear to folks. While this has been formally introduced, we've got a bill number. That does not mean, however, that there can't be further additions made to the bill, right? So like the draft it's been presented this morning at 6 a.m. That is very, very likely not going to be, there could be amendments considered tomorrow. So what's passed out of committee might look different than what, was introduced today. So all that to say, this is going to take on many forms, I think, between now and if this makes its way to the president's desk. So I think, we'll keep everyone in the loop every step of the way to understand what are the changes made, how does that impact, you and your business from a compliance perspective, and we'll continue to give those updates as they occur. So
awesome. My mind is racing right now, by the way, guys. When you were using the analogy for the Christmas tree, it made me think about like back in the day, they used to use real candles in the Christmas trees for lights, which just seems like chaos. I don't know. I had to say that.
Let's hope no fires, literal fires going on in the committee room tomorrow. So
no, and someone from a little bit, not as educational around this as you guys. Does this seem like it's going to kind of go in the same path as the one from 2 years ago? Do you see that same trajectory, and it maybe even taking longer?
I'm afraid so, Cameron. Like I said, I think a lot of the issues that we saw as points of contention 2 years ago, right? Like I mentioned, the private right of action, the enforcement mechanism, the preemption language.
Yeah.
All of these issues were ones that were debated, and unfortunately they become political, right? Where I think it falls upon party lines of kind of how members will react to these different provisions. So I think just given that, and unfortunately we're still, in a very politicized time here in DC, and it's an election year. I would be very surprised if this continues to advance. But I will say, I think people were very surprised at how quickly the TikTok bill advanced during an election year. So I would say, that is an example some people point to where there was agreement on. Obviously, this APRA bill is far more wide
right
than the TikTok divestment bill, but we'll see. I think continue to watch this space, and we'll provide folks an update after tomorrow's committee markup. But I think it'll be interesting to watch for sure.
Any thoughts, Ron? I feel like something's bubbling.
I was just gonna say that if we said that American individual privacy rights was a national security, top of mind, subject, it would probably be getting as much kind of focus and attention as the TikTok bill. Whenever you have something that's kind of intertwined with national security, you're definitely going to have eyes on it. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like a federal privacy law is super top of mind for folks, at least this year. But fingers crossed, we'll see.
Just got to keep pushing for it.
Mhm.
One final thing too, just Ron, you made me think of it, while it might not be in the forefront, I would argue, AI continues to be,
Mhm.
but, short of the White House coming out with a framework on AI, which I think provides kind of a solid foundation that the agencies are looking to implement now, there hasn't been any kind of substantive federal legislation to advance on AI even. So, I would say, and I think we can all agree there are some very serious, national security implications in the AI space. And yet, Congress has not advanced anything in that space. So I just say that as further proof and evidence that I think it's unlikely that this will pass, but let's see what happens tomorrow.
We will. Yeah.
We shall see. Well, let's go ahead and move into our meat topic. I don't even know what that means, but you know what I mean. So the meat of this. State laws that are going into effect after July 1st. So let's go ahead and jump into the first one here. Everybody can notice that Florida state symbol here. Dave, can you fill up?
Yeah, why don't we just do quick table setting, and then
Sure.
we'll kind of provide our folks that are listening. So I'm just going to give some thoughts on, so these states that we're about to cover, Florida, Oregon, Texas, and Montana, these are all states that have in years past enacted statewide privacy laws. So while they were passed years ago, why we're talking about them today is because they are about to go into effect as of next week. So with all these states that I mentioned, there's a lag between when they're actually passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, and then when they go into effect. So that's why these 4 states we're talking about, we want them to be top of mind for you all because they are about to be enforced by all the respective states' attorneys general. So we thought it'd be helpful just to, if you're not aware that these laws are going into effect, we'll kind of give you the top line, most kind of notable and unique provisions that are found within each law. So I'll kind of cover those, and then Ron's going to jump in and again provide that, I think, industry expert kind of his take on how this is relevant for you all in the privacy space. And then, obviously, if there are additional questions you might have, would love to chat. So feel free to reach out if we do have questions on a particular question, or raise your hand. We're happy to kind of talk through this live, or we've got time at the end. But so yeah, let's dive in. The first one,
And super quickly, Dave, I love how you table set from your perspective. So to table set from the operational perspective, to your point, I do try to focus on the outliers because this, as CPOs, as privacy pros, this isn't our first rodeo. Like hearing about a new law that comes into effect this year has just been, kind of becoming commonplace, if you will. So that being said, as chief privacy officers, we want our privacy programs to be mature. We base them on, whether it's a baseline of CCPA plus GDPR. We've already established really mature controls, policies, relationships with stakeholders to make sure that as these laws are coming into effect, we have the ability to quickly pivot or to quickly adjust our privacy programs. So again, we're coming at this with the perspective of you folks here are probably mature enough to have really robust DSAR processes in place, processes to collect consent appropriately. So kind of the baseline privacy program management controls. And what we're doing here is giving you a flavor of some of those outliers that might be of interest to you, that might be of kind of material that would result in a material change to your program, whether it's a privacy policy change or, let's say, for example, the number of days that you might have to respond to a DSAR request. Those are the types of things that we're keeping top of mind, because those are the things that are actually going to impact your privacy program. So again, I think 80% of what we're seeing, well, actually more than that, is stuff we've already have implemented. It's now just taking the 10% outliers and fine tuning your program to make sure that you're, accounting for all these nuances state by state. So as Dave kind of goes state by state, I'll try to comment on any peculiarities and how I would actually implement that in my program if I were in-house today.
Awesome. Let's kick it off again with the Sunshine State here. So Florida passed its Digital Bill of Rights, I believe it was last year. I debated including this. I think some organizations don't even include Florida in their total list of states that have passed comprehensive laws. And the reason for that being is that that first bullet there. So the law itself is a very limited scope in that it only is targeting large tech platforms. So think of the search engines, the Googles, the Metas. The threshold they have there is that the company's annual revenue needs to exceed $1 billion. So it's very clear based on that threshold limit that this is only targeting those giant tech companies. So anyway, I think that's the one kind of the most distinct and unique provision here. I don't know, Ron, there are data minimization, purpose limitation, conditions that are a part of this. Pretty standard, disclosure requirements as it relates to how companies can handle sensitive data. Response timelines pretty standard there. No private right of action. Was there anything else, Ron, that really stuck out to you besides that?
No, I think the limited scope, you hit the nail on the head, Dave. It's something that, again, if I was looking at this and I was a small to medium-sized enterprise, I could most likely say that I'm not doing, more than, is it $1 billion of revenue per year? So again, understanding the scope piece for me would definitely put this on my kind of lower risk register, if you will, of state laws. But that was a good summary, Dave.
I was just going to ask, is there a reason why, I mean, I don't know if they've stated this, but is there a reason why it's only limited to companies that are making over $1 billion in revenue?
I think thinking back to the debate and Governor DeSantis, I think was really trying to be seen as reining in big tech. So I think it was more, political than anything. They could say, this will effectively neuter a lot of the large companies that are maliciously, in words, maliciously, processing consumer data. So it became, this was right around when Disney and Governor DeSantis were at war. So it was a very heated legislative session last year, and I think this was one of the outputs of that heated debate. So
that makes sense. Okay.
Let's move on to, again, I think to bills that might be a little bit more relevant to companies that are tuning in today. So the next state here, we've got Oregon. So Oregon, of all the 4 states we'll discuss today, I think is the one that has the most kind of unique provisions that are just for this particular state law. So the first one, so in contrast to Florida, where there was a very high threshold, Oregon has the opposite, where it's actually a very low threshold of which companies have to exceed to be under the target of this bill. So it sets up 2 different options for companies to be applicable. One, they have to control or process the personal data of over 100,000 consumers. Or the second one is they have to control or process 25,000 consumers while deriving 25% or more annual gross revenue from selling personal data. So I think just those numbers alone would arguably, I think, capture a good amount of companies that are doing business in the state. And so And also, I think one other unique thing just in terms of scope is nonprofits. I would say traditionally in many states, they've been exempted from these different privacy laws. In Oregon, they're called out and they are included in that. So I don't know,
And
Ron.
I was
Yeah.
going to say, yeah, the threshold nuances per state are something that I guess from an operational perspective, we obviously do account for them in terms of determining whether or not the state law is going to apply to us. But I would say that 95% of the time, most businesses, at least small to medium-sized enterprises, are going to need to comply. And that being said, we're not particularly saying, oh, just because we're maybe not today meeting that threshold for the revenue doesn't mean that a couple quarters from now we won't be. So I think it's important to keep in mind as you're thinking about whether or not these state laws apply to you, is that you kind of want to approach it with the sense of you have a baseline that might be, again, looking at something that's been in play already, CCPA, GDPR, maybe even Virginia, and kind of look at how these state laws differ from that baseline versus trying to state by state say, hey, maybe at this point in time, we don't meet the threshold requirements. Why not take a look at Oregon specific, requirements, whether or not it's around, consent revocation timelines or sensitive data, and just really start to build that into your program versus try to do it on a state by state level. Hey, for Oregon, we're going to do this specifically. Like, I think that's where most of my peers are headed towards. They're kind of wanting to give Americans baseline common rights versus saying, oh, in New York, oh, in New Jersey, oh, in Idaho, I'm going to provide this specific individual with this specific right. Whereas it's actually much easier to come with like a baseline that actually covers the most strict requirement and then go from there. Again, there might be nuances state by state that you might want to do on a state by state perspective. We did that a lot with state breach notification laws. But I think, again, just given the number of things that are coming at us, we kind of want to keep that high watermark of a program so that when something does come out, we can rest assured 99% of the time we've kind of hit on all those things. So anyway, I'm just going to say, Dave, like the threshold piece is always something that's a little not complex, but just interesting to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So
Yeah, because I think you said it very well, right? Each state, and we'll talk about Texas and why Texas is unique with its lack of the revenue and processing numbers. But each state is different with those, how they're setting the application thresholds. So, but yeah, the only other things I'd call out is universal opt-out. So I think we're seeing a growing number of states that are looking to require these signals, much like California and Colorado. Oregon requires this universal opt-out mechanism, and this goes into effect also next week as well, where some states delay this universal opt-out mechanism requirement, but this is going into effect for Oregon next week. Unlike California and Colorado, though, Oregon doesn't provide specific requirements for the type of signal. So I don't know, Ron, if you have any more thoughts on that, because I know we're seeing that in a lot of the bills that we'll talk about that have passed this year. We're seeing the universal opt-out become more and more kind of integrated into those newer kind of state privacy bills as well.
yeah, I think it's just going to be table stakes for you to be able to respond to those, GPC signals for sure. Something I did want to call out that I like to applaud about Oregon is they do call out in their personal data definition, whether you're transgender or non-binary, which I think is pretty progressive. And also the status as a victim of a crime, also something that, again, as definitions of sensitive data kind of expand, it's interesting to see what states consider from their perspective as sensitive, because we've had those definitions come into play from a GDPR perspective around, sexual or health life related personal information or political views or trade union status. So again, it's interesting to see how that varies culturally, right? What from an American perspective we consider sensitive versus, from an EU perspective, what they've kind of said requires a further processing consideration and controls. So
cool. I don't think I have anything else on Oregon, Ron, unless should we move on to the Lone Star State here?
Teja.
I think that's actually, yeah, the proper pronunciation there, right?
Is it with
So
do you have to do finger guns as well?
Texas is interesting. So their legislature actually only meets every other year. So they did not meet as a legislature this year, but they are preparing for 2025. So I would imagine we're going to see a lot of debate around AI, data privacy, potentially, now that this is going into effect next week. I would presume that we're going to see some revisiting of this law, maybe some lawmakers introducing bills next year to expand upon this now that this will be, in effect in the state. So I would definitely watch as the legislature gears up to reconvene next year. But what to call out with Texas. So as I kind of previewed, Texas is unique in that where most states have either the revenue or the number of consumers that whose data are being processed, and they use those specific data sets as the thresholds. Texas does not have that. They just specify that the law is applicable for any business that's looking to work in the state. And so what that means in practice is that this is going to apply very broadly into a significant amount of companies that operate in the state. With the one exception being there is a carve out for small businesses. And I think what's unique with Texas is that they've now started a trend where a couple of states, even this year, have introduced this notion of small business carve outs and then tying the definition of small business to a test that was derived from the Small Business Administration here in DC. So it's not a clear-cut definition where, again, it's very dependent on your specific industry, and then there's a number of different factors that go into that. So it's a complicated carve out, I guess I'll call it, but it's unique, and I think it's interesting that we've started to see some other states. I think Nebraska introduced this small business carve out. So, Ron, any thoughts on the scope there?
Yeah, that obviously the lack of any specific criteria is definitely going to put that on the higher risk level in terms, and obviously, Texas is a big state and likely a state that has a lot of commercial activities for most American companies. You'll probably get into this, Dave, but a couple of things that called out to me were the definition of personal data, including pseudonymous data. So again, mirroring what we see in the GDPR. So that was interesting. And then also, if you engage in the sale of sensitive personal data or biometric personal data, you have to put a huge notice on your website that specifically says, we may sell your sensitive personal data. So these kind of more prescriptive notice requirements are always very interesting to me. And from an operational perspective, let's just say I do, sell sensitive personal information or biometric personal information, which I would assume most corporations likely are trying to avoid. But if I was, how am I going to display that on my website? Am I just going to want to display that to folks that are coming in from a Texas IP address? So these types of operational nuances and implications are things that I now have to take to my product team and my engineering teams and explain to them why they exist and why we not as privacy professionals may not necessarily agree with the law, but the law is the law, right? And then work with them to find the most optimal solution for our business. So again, those two call outs are very kind of peculiar to me, but again, from a cultural state perspective, maybe Texas is really adamant about the fact that you have that notice if you're selling sensitive personal data. So
Is that vagueness on purpose?
you mean the specificity?
Yeah.
Lack
Yeah,
of like having those thresholds. Yeah, it's a great, Ron, I'd love your thoughts. Actually, I was wondering that myself. I was hoping to dig into a little bit more on that.
it's interesting because you would think that, again, as this is our 20th law, or one of the, in the grand scheme of things, this is in the teens, if you will, from a state law perspective. You would think that they would actually consider the state by state thresholds that are already at play. But again, I'm not really knowing what went through the minds of the legislators that developed this law. Maybe they just wanted, more kind of control over what was happening from a business perspective. But yeah, I don't know, Dave, if you have any actual back thoughts on that.
No, I'd love to. As
Yeah.
I mentioned, I know Nebraska just passed their comprehensive law this year that won't go into effect, I believe, till 2025 or 2026. But much like Texas, Nebraska also just has this very broad application. So I could see a conservative argument that, the less in their mind, if they're carving out small business as defined by the Federal Small Business Administration, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I was going to dig into that more. So, yeah, I don't have more context there. But again, this could be an issue too, depending on the rollout, again, from July through the end of the year. They do meet as a legislature next year. So that could be an issue, Cameron, that people bring up next session to say, hey, we need to revisit this. We're very distinct from other states that we don't require those application thresholds. Like maybe that could be a topic of debate for them next year to revisit that. So we'll see.
Yeah.
I'm just curious because I just wonder if it's one of those situations where they're just trying to control and manipulate the, what they can kind of get away with, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more to that than that.
One thing I will also say is it's interesting to see these kind of prescriptive things about sensitive data and the notice piece in the actual act versus those are typically covered in regulations, right, Dave? Like the specificity of like what a privacy policy should have, like font. I remember when CCPA came into play, there was like, I think in the first iteration of the regulations, there was something around having a font color and size of your do not sell button be of a certain, again, font and color, and that was covered in a regulation. But it's interesting to see like such a prescriptive piece in the act versus something that might come later on. But anyway,
I think it's, that's definitely the difference between, I would say, more progressive blue states than red states, right? Where California, as you mentioned, was regulating the notices down to the color of the font and the I'm not going to say whether that's good or bad, but I think it's just more, usually you'll see in states like California, New York, very, ultra progressive states, you're going to see a lot more regulations.
Right.
Okay.
So
I think with Texas being ultra conservative, you're going to, I think you'll see one approach, right? Florida, we're just passed a bill saying we're only going to target the biggest tech companies, right? That's one way to say, hey, we're going to not present any red tape. Texas, I would say this is like another example of maybe a more conservative approach.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder if that's just like Florida's thinking of like, just as that as an example, is it easier for them to set a threshold like that instead of it being all companies?
Yeah. And again, that's what most states do. Florida's being extremely high where it's only targeting the, giant tech companies, where most states can lower the thresholds to say, all right, what is in our minds, what are the, what are those right amounts that we want to include for the thresholds there?
Anything else on Texas?
I don't think so. The universal opt-out, so that won't go into effect until January of next year. So there's a little bit of a delay for those universal opt-out mechanism requirements. But other than that, no, I think we've covered it all.
All right.
Montana, we wanted just to quickly touch on Montana. The other three bills we discussed, again, those go into effect next week. Montana is the last bill that will go into effect this year. So as you can see, that will be October 1. Really not a ton that's unique. Not to say I love Montana as a state, but there wasn't much unique or different about this particular privacy bill. There was a somewhat distinct in the threshold limits. They have a exclusion relating to personal data that's processed for completing payment transactions. So I think that was interesting in that they exclude that from like the level of consumers that are needed to become targeted by the bill. But
And that unique nuance, Dave, again, from an operational perspective, am I gonna go to my teams and say, can you tell me if we've had hit at least 50,000 Montanans, but also just exclude payment transactions? That's very just operationally burdensome. So again, if I'm looking at this and seeing if I'm within the scope, I'm likely just going to, again, go ahead and comply with the requirements because it's just easier to give Montanans kind of those baseline requirements that I've been seeing in California and elsewhere versus say for Montana residents, hey team, we need to build out this separate flow. So again, just operational perspective there that we're not these types of nuances around exclusions and scope and all that. We do consider them, but there's just something that we're just going to say let's just apply it all universally, right? So
Ron, I don't know if there's anything else. The definition of sale of personal data is similar to I think what's been passed in Connecticut, and then the universal opt-out again won't go into effect until January, so a little bit more time there to implement that. But was there anything else to call out for Montana?
no, I think the valuable consideration piece was in a couple of other state laws. I can't remember, but yeah, I think the trend is to expand to just monetary consideration to other types of, valuable consideration, and I think we'll see just that trend continue.
Awesome. So that's that. Again, these are all laws that will be going into effect this year. I think in the remaining time, definitely want to keep some time for those that might have questions. But in the remaining time, we wanted just to give a quick overview, looking back of this year's legislative session, like what's occurred, what bills have passed. So yeah, Cameron, if you can advance to the next slide.
Okay.
Drum roll. Here we go. Here are the numbers. So far, I guess to date this week, only 9 states are still in session. So thinking back to January, when nearly every state begins their legislative session, all but 9 states have adjourned for the year. So now what they're doing is they're prepping for 2025. So looking back, 7 states, which is a lot, thinking back to when California went into effect with CCPA, I think year after year, we're continuing to see just an increase in the amount of bills. So 7, I believe that is probably, I think we might be tied for last year, but 7 is a lot of states just in this first half of the year that have passed comprehensive data privacy laws. So you can see the list of 7 states there. And I think importantly, the effective dates of when they go into effect. One caveat, so Rhode Island just passed their bill, I believe on June 13th. That's yet to be signed by the governor. I haven't seen anything to believe that he will veto. But if the veto does not occur, then that bill will go become effective January 1, 2026. One notable issue here is Vermont. So like I mentioned here, there was Vermont did pass a comprehensive privacy bill. It was significant in that many in the privacy industry championed this bill because short of California, it was the only other state that implemented a private right of action. Again, allowing an individual to bring suit against a company for violating what was in the bill. Very controversial issue, so much so that the governor cited that as one of the reasons why he vetoed the bill. Additionally, there was a section on children's privacy that is currently being contested in the court system in the Ninth Circuit. So I think that also added to the controversial nature of the bill. So that was ultimately vetoed by the governor. The legislature failed to override that veto. So Vermont, unfortunately, is back to square one in terms of pushing forward a privacy bill.
When you say back to square one, Dave, do you mean they can't simply adjust that draft of that current version of the act, or what does that mean actually in terms of going back to square one?
Great question. So again, all of these states work off of certain calendars. So if they don't get all states are going through an election in November, the makeup of the legislature is going to look different after November than it does currently. Since that was not passed, or since that was vetoed, they will now have to start that process over again come January when they reconvene. So there could be consensus still amongst legislators that, hey, we still think that's a good foundation, but that will it'll have to go through the whole committee process, pass out of both chambers. There could be new legislators now that are voted in office, right? So I think that's just
who might want to make their own mark as well.
Exactly.
New draft, right?
And knowing, I need to check if the governor is up for election, but if the governor's remains, will they be swayed differently on the issues like private right of action than they were, this year? So I think they'll just have to deal with all of those issues next year if they decide to push for this again. And it's the last call out. There are 5 state laws that are still moving. So some states, these states mentioned here, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, they have some have year-round legislative sessions. Some, I think North Carolina adjourns at the end of July, and all these states are moving on comprehensive data privacy bills. So this 7 number might actually be increase even more so. So we'll see, whether the bills in those states get over the finish line. But I did want to call out that we still have a chance to bump that number up from 7 through the rest of the year. But
we do have a question.
Yeah.
From Luke. Thanks, Luke. With all these new comprehensive state privacy laws, have you identified anything unique, different compared to traditional privacy laws like CCPA, GDPR? Or have you found that the majority of these state privacy laws take a spin on what is already in practice from a common control standpoint? Great question.
Yeah, I think, and Dave, obviously you'll have your thoughts, but I think it's more of the latter. I don't think, if we take CCPA/GDPR as a baseline of common controls, if you will, so if we look at, basic privacy program elements around transparency, choice, access, notification, reach notification, there's no state post California that is really doing anything groundbreaking to introduce a novel common control, if you will. I will say that I'm seeing this concept of data minimization, which again we've had for decades, if you will, from a kind of core privacy kind of rights perspective, pop up a lot more in the language that and Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think CCPA or CIPRA actually uses the data minimization piece, but they do have a flavor of it in terms of purpose limitation. But this concept of data minimization I'm seeing flourish a lot more. But again, from a common controls baseline perspective, I don't see any, at least from the ones that we've covered so far, introduce anything materially novel. But Dave, yeah, any
No, I think You handled that very well. Each state is, moving on their own approach. I think taking elements of California, taking elements of Virginia, I think was passed, and Virginia is seen as more of the business friendly model in contrast to, I would say a more restrictive model like California. So I think you see varying levels of specifications based on, I think, the politics of the state. You talk about data minimization, Ron. I know Maryland is on this list that just passed. I think they really enshrine data minimization within their model. So that was, I think Maryland is very much more on the similar to California, where it's going to be a very complex system to be compliant with. So that is one that I think you'll need to very much prepare for. But
For sure. And then operationally speaking, oh, sorry, go ahead, Cam.
No. Go ahead. I'll
I was
save
going
it.
to say that concept of data minimization from an operational perspective, we've seen again this sense of, yes, we should be limiting the purposes for why we're collecting and using data, but now we're actually going further and saying we should actually be fully considering the notion of minimizing the data that's at play. And so how do you actually do that operationally? It's through DPIAs, it's through privacy impact assessments, it's through engaging stakeholders that are actually using the data, like product, like engineering, and saying to them, now you guys have to act, or now you folks actually have to take into the account that we can't use all the data just because we can. We have to have the mindset of minimization, which I think is going to be a giant culture shift for a lot of companies, especially in tech, who come with the mindset of, again, breaking things fast and kind of going forth and coming up with new ideas and being super coming up with these new products and services, whereas now they're going to have to take into account the fact that they actually can't use just whatever because they want to. So again, long story short, just this data minimization piece, I think, is just an operational complexity and definitely a mind shift for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
a great
I was-
question.
Sorry,
Yeah, we had another question, a follow up from Luke. He's trying to shift it a little bit towards any takes on the state AI acts, Colorado, Utah. Any recommendations, considerations for privacy pros?
I think Luke must have previewed I know if we had time, we were going to touch on the Colorado AI bill. So
Yeah, there we go.
we've got a couple minutes. Happy to touch on that, as I do think it's significant in that it is the first state in the US that has passed a comprehensive risk-based approach for how to regulate deployers and developers of AI. So I think it's significant in that, very much like the EU AI Act, again, it's establishing that kind of risk-based framework. But I do think it's interesting, even since its passage, Governor Polis signed the bill. And I think most recently, the governor, the attorney general, and one of the lead Democratic lawmakers that was involved in drafting the bill have signed an open letter basically saying that they've committed to revisit the bill next session. And the bill will not go into effect until 2026, which I think is interesting to point out, because the speed of which the tech is going to evolve with AI, think of where we'll be in 2026, and how far we've come from when, the generative AI models were, first started taking rise and back in 2022. So I just think legislatures are going to have to deal with the speed of which how the technology evolves, and how do they keep up with these laws that, again, won't go into effect for a number of years. But Ron, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on Colorado.
Yeah, I know we're at time, but I will say, when I was in Brussels meeting with some EU lawmakers that were part of the AI Act passing, one of the specific folks that I spoke to, humorously noted that a lot of the stuff in the Colorado AI Act was somewhat of a lift from the EU AI Act, which again is nothing wrong with that. It's just funny that again, the EU Commission and Parliament go through this extensive exercise of back and forth and debate and cultural, conversation that is specific to how the EU feels they should be rolling out AI governance. And then we just have a direct lift from a US perspective. So yeah, it's going to be fun to see how other states react, especially California, who touts itself to be kind of at the forefront of anything kind of data protection legislation specific. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what we come up with both state by state and federally on AI.
Really quick, I know we're at time, but Luke, feel free to reach out. I think watch Colorado as there's going to be a revisiting of that bill next year, and then California in the next couple months, we're going to see, I think, some significant headlines around AI policy in Sacramento. There's a bill that's currently making its way through the process there, Scott Wiener's bill. Anyway, that's going to be really interesting to see how that shakes out in California as well.
To that point, I know we're at time, but I was curious, since we got you guys here, is there one state, maybe it's Colorado, but is there one state you think that you would maybe look at as a privacy professional in terms of a state that actually has that kind of thinking outside of the traditional privacy laws? Do you think there's a state that's going to, like California, maybe make a major change that might shift things elsewhere? Do you think there's a state we could look forward to in the future that we might see something like that?
Well, we saw something kind of interesting pop up in Washington with the My Health, My Data Act, which was somewhat of a surprise, I'd say. So maybe Washington might come up with something similarly surprising from an AI perspective, but that's my just immediate call out. I don't know, Dave, what your thoughts would be on.
No, I would say Maryland was, I think, a standout this year in just that I think privacy advocates really, I think, were pleased with how strong the Maryland bill was. And given that Vermont was vetoed, I would say that I think is going to be lauded as kind of the new benchmark for kind of state privacy laws. But no, it's a good question. But watch this space. Like I said, we could get this number up to 12. I don't think it'll be all 12, but there's still states that could move. So we'll be sure to provide updates as those state laws pass.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for being here, taking this time, and thank you, Luke, for the questions, and thank you for everyone for being here. And we'll see you guys next time.
Sounds good. Thanks
all.